Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Korg Wavestation tutorial. Today we're going to have a look at oscillators. The oscillator, as I explained in the previous episode, my introduction episode, I'll put a link to that above if you need to see that. This is the smallest kind of usable component of sound. We put together multiple oscillators to build up patches and parts and performances, but there's no point running before we can walk. So today we're going to figure out how those oscillators are put together. Now today I'm going to be using a template file that I give away to my patrons and channel members. And if you'd like to support my channel, that's an awesome way to do it. Now you don't need this template file itself. It's just nice to have a very simple sandpit in which to play, where a lot of the effects and other stuff that we don't need to see right now, all of that's been thrown away. And my template contains a really simple organ sound. Before we dive into the edit screen, and that's where we're going to spend the majority of today, just a very quick word about a couple of other features that I didn't mention in the previous episode. The first is your screen size option in utility. Really useful. I have it set to extended, which is the largest interface that you can have, depending on your monitor size, salt to taste. The other thing in the settings page is the output gain. I think the Wavestation is a bit quiet compared with other plugins. It very often struggles to make itself heard. You can boost the entire output of the synthesizer by setting your output gain. I mess between +6 and +12, but I very rarely have it set to the default of 0. I think that's too quiet. And the other really useful option I'll mention in the settings page before we head off is the global transpose. This again, really useful. Sometimes you'll dial up a preset. It sounds great, but the entire thing is 1 or 2 octaves too low or high. You can set the entire synthesizer, the transpose value from there. With that said, let's jump over to the edit page and have a look at how this oscillator is built. Now the patch page in which your oscillators live, and as we saw in the previous episode, you can have up to 4 of them, is really split into 2 primary functional areas. On the right hand side, we have something that's only really useful for multiple oscillators, and that's beyond today's discussion because we're going to restrict ourselves to a single oscillator. So this modulation matrix on the right hand side is all about mixing together more than one oscillator. We're not interested in that today. What we do want to examine though are these tabbed options down below. So let's start off on the left hand side with the pitch tab. Now it stands to reason this is where we have global control of the oscillator tuning. As I'm pressing that note, I have to press it multiple times. If you press a key and hold it down and then make changes to the interface, those changes don't register until the next note on event. So just bear in mind, don't fall into the trap of holding a chord down and make changes to your synthesizer and expect to hear them straight away. You won't. This pitch tab is our first introduction to macros. We have this macro option and it's currently set to user, which basically means I've done something to this sound. If you edit it in any way, then the macro option will set to user. What the macros do, and this is global across the entire synthesizer, you'll see the word macro in lots of different places. It's basically presets for whatever specific feature of the synth you're looking at. So this is preset options to control pitch. If we click on the macro, you can see the various options. Descending sweep is a really good one to give us a good idea of what sort of pitch modulation options we have here. You can see this very simple graph, and it's always a 2-node graph. Some of the other tabs have more complicated envelope options, but for pitch control, we simply have 2 nodes that allow us to draw a straight line. Now, every time I press a key, we get a pitch sweep according to this graph. If I bring in the time element to make that pitch sweep happen faster, and you saw as I moved that line, the ramp time changes. Instead of having a descending pitch sweep, we could have an ascending pitch sweep because this graph is bidirectional. And every time I change the y-axis, the ramp amount changes. You can make those edits from either direction. So if I click on the ramp amount number and drag up and down with my mouse, it's exactly the same as making the change with the user interface. Velocity amount is another feature that you'll see very commonly in different areas of the synth. This is going to allow us to specify how much the weight of the key is going to influence this overall modulation envelope. So at the moment, velocity is having no effect. Regardless of how hard I hit the key, you always get exactly the same pitch bend. If I increase velocity amount, I'll make this number nice and extreme so it's really easy to hear, and make the ramp amount pretty steep. So now I'll play a quiet note, very little pitch bend, and louder. Pitch bend is steeper. If I control click any of these options, it's going to reset it to some kind of internal default. It doesn't always go to 0. Each parameter in the synthesizer is going to have a different default. This bend range option, which is currently set to global, is tied to our settings page. So we have an overall pitch bend range of 2 semitones. This is obviously the pitch bend wheel. So there's my C. And then as you can see in the tuner, a full pitch bend sweep. You can see the pitch bend wheel in the bottom left hand corner actually. That gets me 2 semitones up. I can override that default or global behavior by clicking in it and setting a different pitch bend range instead. There's my C. And now pitch bend up to E. Set it back to global. If I want the overall envelope of this effect to be more intense, I can modify the slope. So basically 1 is the default. That's going to be like the standard behavior. But if I increase this slope, its maximum is 2. Now everything is going to be more extreme. The pitch bend sweep is also going to be more extreme. Okay, so that's basic options. I'm just going to do some control clicking here to get myself back to a flat line. So that's our basic static options. Now let's talk about modulation sources. Now I've just noticed a flaw in my supposedly completely flat template because I have a modulation amount here set to LFO1. That should be 0. Let's have a look at what it does first, and I'm actually going to edit my template to make this 10 go away. What's basically happening here is that we have vibrato being applied to the pitch. We have an oscillator called a low frequency oscillator, and it has its own tab. Here it is. It's a triangular low frequency oscillator. And this modulator, this low frequency oscillator that's cycling quite slowly, is modulating the pitch of every note that we play. This +10 here is applying a very subtle vibrato to every note that we play. I'm going to increase the amount so that you can hear it more extremely. And I didn't notice that it had that very subtle vibrato set. The speed of that modulation is being controlled by the rate. And this is a perfect opportunity actually for us to talk about modulation sources generally. So essentially the way you want to look at these 7 tabs across the bottom of the screen is that the left-hand 4 of them are action tabs. They're going to do something. They're going to have some effect on the sound. The right-hand 3 tabs are all modulators. They're all going to change those sounds in some way. So here we have an oscillator, a very slow cycling oscillator mapped into the pitch tab, which is generating a vibrato effect. Now most options on the Wavestation that can be modulated by 2 different sources simultaneously. So in addition to us being able to modulate the pitch using source 1, which is currently a triangular low frequency oscillator, let's set this amount to 0. Now I'm going to try control clicking, but for this particular parameter, for some inexplicable reason, it defaults to +2. So I'll just manually bring it down to 0. Now I'm going to take my modulation source from envelope 1 instead. So this is the second modulation source. Got lots of different options to pick from, but it defaults to envelope 1. That gives us an opportunity to have a look at envelope 1. First thing that I'm going to do is dial in some amount, so it's going to do some work. And then let's go and have a look at it. So now instead of having a constantly repeating oscillator, basically the triangle drawing again and again, envelopes do their thing once and then they're done. So over the course of a period of time specified by these nodes, we're going to have some sort of modulation effect on the pitch. Now as things stand, that's not going to be a very interesting effect. You can just hear when I let go of the key. Listen very carefully. Can you hear as I let go of the key, there's a very, very brief drop in pitch. That's because we have some modulation on the release cycle but this particular sound has a very short release cycle. So let's make the envelope do something more interesting. Now there's actually a hidden node here. There are two little squares sat on top of each other. Drag that one out of the way. The one that I'm most interested in though is this first one. This is our initial envelope level. If I set that down to 0, now over a period of time, all of these numbers are arbitrary. Korg, basically this is something that's very common to Korg synthesizers. They generally work in values of 0 to 127, and behind the scenes those numbers mean something, and you need to go away to the manual to find out what they actually mean. But basically we're going to have a period of time over which this pitch ramps up now using this envelope. There we go, make it faster. The other nodes in the envelope give us more flexibility. So what we have here is an attack, decay, decay, sustain, release envelope. The reason I said the word decay twice is because we have the option to specify two different journeys that the envelope will take while we have the key held down. Listen to this. Up, down, and then back up again. We went up, down, and then back up. We settle out at this final penultimate node. This is the sustain node. This is going to be the modulation level. Don't forget, we're not talking about volume here. We're talking about modulation of something else in the synthesizer. This is where our pitch is going to stabilize. Once we've finished, now if I change this node, don't forget it doesn't update in real time, but the next time I press a key, we settle out at a new pitch. So the pitch modulation is going to follow this journey every time. If we want to reduce the impact, the effect that that envelope's having on the pitch, we simply reduce the amount level. And now the envelope is still doing exactly the same job behind the scenes. It's just having a smaller effect on its destination. Finally, we can combine those two modulation sources together, and you'll just get the composite effect of both of them operating simultaneously. So you heard the envelope affect the sound at the beginning, and then once it was done and it had kind of got out of the way, then we're just left with the low frequency oscillator cycling on its own. Okay then, let's get rid of this envelope, Control click. Oh, that one sets to 0. But the story about modulation doesn't finish there, because the modulators can themselves also be modulated. The low frequency oscillator can be modulated in two different ways. We can control its depth using this modulation source, and we can also control its speed. And in this case, it's mapped to aftertouch. Let's deal with each one of these one at a time. Firstly, the modulation wheel. If I move my modulation wheel, you can see it going up and down in the interface. So I'll set it to 0 at the moment. Now I'll press a key. Now I'll increase the modulation wheel. Can you hear the pitch range, the depth of that modulation, the maximum and minimum pitches? It expands, basically, it stretches to cover a wider range of the keyboard. So that's the depth being modulated by the modulation wheel. Let's set that back to 0. Now we'll modulate our rate, or the speed of oscillation. So if I increase the amount for my aftertouch, I'll play a key. Now I'm going to press into the aftertouch. There I went. And the modulation sped up. So two different metrics by which the low frequency oscillator can itself be modulated. Once you've figured out what it's going to do, then you send it somewhere in the synthesizer and it can have an effect. You can ask the LFO not to start immediately if we introduce a delay and then play a key. We started out stable and then the low frequency oscillation came in. Very common effect. Really good for acoustic kind of natural sounds, because that's basically how human beings apply vibrato when they're doing this stuff. We can set a static initial amount. If I increase that, the entire modulation is just now more intense. Now here's an interesting thing with initial amount. I've just set it to 0. I'm going to verify that we still have LFO being assigned to pitch modulation here. But if I press a key, you don't hear any pitch variance at all. That's because we don't have any initial amount and our modulation depth source is currently set to 0. The modulation wheel is still set to 0. So basically this LFO is not currently doing any work. We haven't assigned an initial value. We don't have any depth increase from the modulation wheel. And so the effect that it's having on its destination is 0. However, if I increase the modulation wheel, there it is coming in. So you've got multiple different metrics by which you can control this stuff. A nice thing to introduce when we play with delay is also fading. So there's going to be a period of time when there's no oscillation, and then slowly it will be brought in for an even more natural effect. And I'll bring my initial amount back. Gradual introduction, it gets more and more deep. Finally, the sync allows us to basically regulate the LFO to make sure that every time we press a key, it starts from exactly the same point. It basically just gives you more stability. If sync is off, the LFO is constantly cycling in the background, and whenever we press a key, we're just basically kind of jumping onto this modulator, whatever its current value happens to be. Now let's have a look at the filter tab. So this is a pretty straightforward low-pass filter. The original Wavestation wasn't resonant, but recent versions of the plugin are. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Our macro options include a bypass feature, so basically there is no filtering. If we click on it, we've got various options here. Let's choose low pass first. You can see various options, that's the preset. Various options in this filter have just been changed. Now I'm not going to lie to you, the filter in the Wavestation in exciter mode isn't exciting at all. What's basically happening is it's dulling the entire thing, but it's not a particularly interesting filter sound. Everything that I do to this filter is having very little effect. It's making it duller as I bring the cutoff down. I'm throwing away more and more high frequencies. But frankly, it's just not very interesting at all. However, when we change the mode to resonance mode, we get a more usable filter. This is much the better, much the superior filter as far as I'm concerned. The original Wavestation didn't have a resonant filter. This is something that's been added to the plugin. There's no mention of this in the manual either. The manual hasn't been updated since 2005. So they've made changes to the plugin and not updated them in the documentation. Now that we've switched to resonant mode, we have a more interesting filter. I'm going to introduce some resonance. There you go. It takes a moment to dial in something that's reasonably usable. If you listen very carefully to this note actually, you can also hear that we've got a little bit of modulation from envelope 1. So this is an example of these modulation sources being tied to multiple different destinations. There's no limit to the number of destinations to which any single modulator can be routed. And that shape that we drew in the previous example is still there, having its M-shaped filter effect. This is pretty ridiculous. If I control click on this value, I get plus 55. So let's set that to 0. So that's the envelope modulator gone away now. And we're just hearing the default filter. Let's get a little bit more extreme. And then we'll bring our envelope back in. Let's make the envelope a bit more sensible. So that's the envelope attack level. We're just basically using it as an attack stage now. The rest of it we're not particularly interested in. But we're getting that filter sweep every time we play a note. It's really common to assign an envelope to filter cutoff to get those inherent sweeps for every note that you play. It's also very common to use keyboard tracking. What this basically means, once again, this is another one of these 0, minus 127 to plus 127 actually. More often than not, it'll be a positive value, and it means the further up the keyboard that you play, the filter cutoff is shifted. It just means that the cutoff has a closer relationship with the note that you're playing, rather than being an arbitrary, completely fixed in place kind of concept. Very low cutoff for the low notes, and that cutoff tracking up the keyboard, as opposed to the cutoff frequency is fixed. It's only the pitch of the note that's changing. Let's bypass that again. I'm going to leave pan for the moment because it's a little bit more complex and involves multiple output routing, but we are going to have a look at the amplifier today. This is basically controlling volume. The simplest demonstration for the Amplitude envelope is to introduce a volume sweep using the attack phase. So now every note that I play starts out at 0 level and increases over this period of time. Once again, we have a double decay phase and a release phase. If I make a much longer release phase, let's make that a bit more sensible. The sound is introduced gradually and then fades away as well with the release. Let's make that a bit longer. There we go. If you apply a low frequency oscillator to Amplitude, you get tremolo. And if we modulate the rate, there we go. As far as manipulating these envelopes are concerned, generally speaking, I pick up the nodes and do it that way, but you can actually make edits using the numbers themselves. Just click in any of these numbers and you're editing the node directly. You can even double click in them and type an explicit value if you want to do it that way. Velocity envelope amount defaults to +127. This is basically the thing that gives you touch sensitivity on your keyboard. If you set this to 0, your keyboard has no touch sensitivity. So if I set a really simple envelope and get rid of this LFO as well, every key that I play, regardless of whether I play it as softly as I can or as hard as I can, is all exactly the same volume. Now the default value for this when I control click is actually +100. So soft key, loud key, some variants, make it really extreme, and you get a wider range of velocity sensitivity. Pretty straightforward stuff. The attack velocity modifier, let's increase that. I'm going to set this back to 0 actually. Allows us to change how fast it takes to get from 0 to maximum. In other words, the attack phase, depending on how hard we hit the key. So if I increase my attack velocity modifier, I'll play a soft key. It takes a long time to get to the attack value. Now I'll play the same key with greater velocity. Just get there straight away. So you can actually control the attack time with how hard you hit the key. And finally, the keyboard modifier is the most esoteric of them. If I increase this, it's basically going to affect the first decay stage, not the second decay stage, just the first decay stage, plus the release time. So basically these two nodes are going to have their times modified by this value, depending on where on the keyboard we play. So a low note has a much longer overall release cycle. I've let go of the key now. That's the release cycle that you're hearing there. It's going to take a while to actually fade away to 0. Now I'll play a high key. Did you hear that kind of blip? That's because the decay phase for that really high key was really, really fast. And similarly, when I let go of the key, it fades away more or less instantly. Okay, that's quite a lot of information to absorb. I think we'd better stop there. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.